Thank you so much, Johnson, for being here.
Thank you.
Now let's start with this year's theme, delivering on Africa's promise. When you heard that, what does that mean to you?
You know, the truth is that Africa is a promising continent. Africa, they tell you, is the next frontier. Is a country that the continent other continents in the world are expecting that would drive economic development in the world. If you look at Africa, the transition Africa has gone through the past 20 years. You look at Africa in the 1990s. Africa was a country that was described by the economists as a hopeless country, as a hopeless continent, because Africa was plagued by so many civil wars. You had pictures of Africa was actually epitomized by the pictures of child soldiers in Sierra Leone and Liberia. We had crisis in Rwanda, crisis in Congo Democratic Republic. We had crisis in Burundi, just name it. Angola and all the rest. So Africa was then like a hopeless continent. But now Africa is going through a transition, and Africa is transiting from a hopeless continent to a continent of hope. But now Africa has not just gone beyond the continent of hope, and as Africa is now what is described as Africa rising. So Africa is a continent that the whole world is expecting to drive economic activities going forward. You see, okay, go ahead.
No, it would seem that well, we're not the people who are blowing the trumpet, at least blowing it the loudest for us. You know, are the people on the other side of the continent, of the globe, as it were, the West. And you know, some might argue that yes, where else would they go? We've seen the financial crisis. The economies there are still, you know, growth is still very much sluggish. Now they're looking for where to put their money, looking for where these capital flows will go, and of course, where else to look, you know, here in Africa. And would you also say that the African leaders have put their money where their mouth is? Yes, you know, many have said that the 21st century is Africa's century, but many of these problems still bedevil, you know, the continent. Yes, we've seen conflict come down. We're seeing growth, significant growth in a couple of countries, but you know, the issues are still there.
Yes, the issues are not going to vanish overnight. But you have to look at what direction are we moving. And we are moving in a positive direction. If you look at the statistics on Africa, African countries account for 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies currently. The 10 fastest growing economies in the world, African countries account for 7 of that. That's 7 of the fastest growing economies. Africa currently has a GDP of about $1 trillion. Africa has a population of 1 billion people. Of that 1 billion people, Africa has about the 1 billion Africans, 65% of working force of Africans are below the age of 35. That makes Africa the youngest continent in the world.
Yes, we also have a very high youth unemployment rate.
Yes, of course, 70% of African employable labor are unemployed. Those are the challenges we are talking of, and those are what we are talking of transition. There's huge, fast growth in the African continent, but that growth has not translated into into employment, and those are the challenges that the World Economic Forum was meant to address. How do we build an economy or the economies in Africa such that the fast growth, the fact that 70% of African countries are growing above every other country in the world, can actually translate to job creation? How do we move away from an extractive industry-oriented economies to economies that add value to those inputs? And those are the issues that we are discussed at this year's forum or conference. You see, today, of the 54 African states, African countries I will call them, 40 African countries are dependent on export of mining or mining-related products for their economic position or economic strength. That does not allow for value added. So the key question is this: how do we restructure African economies so that those extractive industries will move from mere extractive industries to value added industries, so that we stop exporting just raw materials and importing finished products? Take for instance Nigeria. We export crude, which is our biggest export, and we import refined products. Take for instance Zambia, they export copper and import the final products. Liberia is exporting raw gold and importing what? Refined gold items. So you find out that apart from Kenya, which has a strong tea industry, virtually all African countries, 40 of the 54 African countries, are exporting mineral materials.
Still heavily reliant on natural resources.
Yes. And when these products leave the African continent, the values are added to them and they're exported back to Africa at huge profit to those European countries. That's one of the areas we're looking at. The other area is this. With a 1 billion population, a 1 trillion GDP, cumulative African GDP, how do we stimulate more trade between African countries? Because the truth is that if African countries trade more with themselves, they are further insulated from economic vagaries of the developed countries. Because the truth is that our trading partners, which used to be North America, which is Europe, US, and related neighboring countries, and then Europe, are actually having challenges with economies. So, developing countries need to trade more with themselves to sustain their economic tempo. Otherwise, the slowdown in economic activities in the Western world countries will gradually affect product prices, particularly extractive product prices. And the challenge is this: how do we stimulate trade between African countries? Today, the trade between African countries is only 10% of the trade African countries engage in. 8% of the entire trade African countries engage in is what we call as intra-African trade. That is contrary to what they have in other countries. In Europe, the trade between European countries is about 60%. In Asia, it's significantly higher than what we have in Africa. So imagine if we African countries trade more with each other. The multiplier effect on job employment, unemployment, on GDP growth. And so those are some of the issues that the World Economic Forum.
Were there any definite statements, definite policies? Like, obviously, you brought up a very good point. We're seeing China trying to boost domestic demands now because it's, exports have fallen. We know sluggish growth in the Europe and the US. Its two biggest major customers now requiring less exports. Now, for African leaders, like you said, still trade between or among African countries still very low. Did you get a sense of commitment to this particular issue?
You see, one of the things the African leader came were expected to do is to address those bottlenecks to trade between African countries. Those bottlenecks have been clearly defined. One, if you listen to the president's speech, he did mention that a lot of investment, about $10 billion, will be invested in the power sector in Nigeria for the next 5 or so years. Because we realize that some of the major constraints to trade between African countries are infrastructural deficiencies. Take, for example, the transport system. Of course, there's going to be a road system that will run from here to Ivory Coast. That's already in the works. A West African road network that is supposed to traverse about 6 of the West African countries. That, like Aliko Dangote did say, that it will take him 3 weeks to move cement from Lagos to Ghana. When Ghana is a shorter distance than Abuja. Ghana is about 400 kilometers. Abuja is about 600 kilometers or 580 kilometers. But it takes you, because you have to go through Benin Republic and Togo to get to Ghana. You have a lot of bottlenecks, despite the fact that we're supposed to have common ECOWAS tariff, CET, that's supposed to facilitate easy movement of goods and personnel between those countries. But if you try to take your products by road to a place like Ghana, it will take you several days. Also, the only option they have is to now ship the product. So they have to take the product all the way to the wharf and get a vessel to ship it to Ghana. And you also know that there are few shipping companies that have actually as their base or as their focus the African continent. So you find out that if you have to ship a product from one African country to another, sometimes the product has to go to Europe first and then come back to Africa. So those are some of the bottlenecks that we addressed. Look at air transport. There was a time I was going to Congo Democratic Republic when I was on the board of a bank there. And for me to move from Lagos to Congo, to Kinshasa, I have to first fly to Nairobi, Kenya, and then fly back west to Nigeria. So I fly past Kinshasa, go as far as East Africa, and then fly back west. It was only on this recently that Arik started flying to Kinshasa. So you find out that the level of transport links between Africans is so poor, and those are the things that the government have to address. Then you have to talk of issue of common tariff. We have the Southern African Development Corporation, SADC. We have the East African CODESA. And then we have West African ECOWAS. There should be some level of integration of these common groups or common economic groups, so that there will be seamless movement of goods and personnel across Africa. If you find it difficult to move from one country to the other, you cannot have smooth trade. So some of these bottlenecks have been identified. The challenge is that the government needs to begin to put in place the structures and the policies to eliminate the barriers to trade between African countries. The Chinese population is about 1.2 billion. That's just slightly higher than the African population, 1 billion, like I said. And the African population is expected to grow to 2 billion by 2050. So Africa should be the biggest continent, one of the largest continents, apart from Asia, by 2015. 2050, with a population of 2 billion. So we need to facilitate trade between this huge population. And like I said, you have a continent that has 65% of the labor of the population at below 35 years.
Yes, and many of them still jobless. I'll come into that issue. It's a problem that's both very dominant in the West, the U.S., Europe. We're looking at Eurozone unemployment climbing every month, every quarter, but we're looking at it's actually dropping in the U.S. Funny enough. But here in Africa, here in Nigeria, we're still grappling with that. South Africa over 25%, Nigeria here to over 25%, and that number is higher among the youth. Now, one area that's been identified is agriculture, and if we're moving fast enough in infrastructure, construction, that could also create jobs. Now, I assume some of those issues were discussed there. Now, but beyond the rhetorics, which some of the summits are known for, leaders just gather together and then they talk and then they go away, we come back, we take a look at the score sheet. Not much progress, is usually recorded. But then for the average African citizen, for the average Nigerian, all they want to know is they want these things to be provided, they want the jobs, they want to see infrastructure. Are we moving fast enough?
Well, I don't think we're moving fast enough because if you look at our potential GDP growth rate, we are at least 15% behind our potential GDP growth rate. If we fix the infrastructural base of this country, we should at the moment be growing above 20%. But we're just growing at less than 7%, 6.5%, 6.7% currently. And so that means we are not growing as fast as our potential GDP growth rate. But like I did say, some of these bottlenecks are fundamental bottlenecks. They cannot be addressed overnight. But the key thing, are we moving in the right direction? I think we are. If you look at in terms of infrastructure development, President General did say that if you have transversed Nigeria in the recent past, you will observe that there has been a lot of investment in road network, in road infrastructure. That this government has been building and rebuilding and repairing roads. That the rail system just started working. Okay, like I did say earlier, there's been an agreement to build a West African highway linking Nigeria to as far as Ivory Coast. Those infrastructure is what we need to catalyze economic growth. Then on the area of agriculture, beyond the basic raw materials, Africans need to support the agriculture sector by building agro-allied industries that will add value to those products we produce.
You mean the African governments themselves?
No, well, African government will stimulate that. African governments will do that, encourage that.
When you say Africans, are you talking about the private sector? Because if we're going to use Nigeria as an example, remember that we still have the issue of credit. How much, how easy is the access to credit?
Okay, let me tell you how the government, government acts as catalyst, and the private sector to take the lead of the government. If you take, for instance, the cement industry, in the 70s, that's what we call the cement Amanda. The cement Amanda was a situation where the seaports were clogged by cement that was imported to the country and could not be discharged. And today, Nigeria is now exporting cement. What happened? What changed? The simple thing I said, that government now granted a lot of incentive to cement manufacturers and imposed restriction on importation of cement. And that encouraged the likes of Bua, the likes of Lafarge, the likes of CCNN, the likes of Dangote, to invest heavily in cement. We're now talking of sugar. And you could see that a couple of companies are already investing in the sugar industry.
Yeah, but for a country as big as Nigeria, we're still having 2, 3 key players. I mean, we could have so much, so much more.
Yes, like I did say that. You see, you're not going to see a sudden. You're not going to have a light bulb effect. You wake up and then there's lights everywhere. It wouldn't happen. It's going to be a transition.
Johnson, let's talk about the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa added not too long ago, and how Africa can partner with the BRICS. Remember, financial or world economists had looked to the BRICS to help spur growth after that financial crisis, and we can only look at maybe 2 or 3 of them doing quite well. Brazil or India over 6% GDP. South Africa not doing too well, just over 2%. Brazil around 3.4%. Russia not doing too well at 2%. So, do you think that should we still focus on the BRICS, or perhaps just look at a better partnership between Africa and the BRICS?
Well, I think if you look at the BRICS, the performance of the BRICS is dependent on the structure of the economies. If you look at China, for instance, China has been successful in focusing the economy from an export-oriented economy to an inward consuming, eternally dependent economy. And that has been the reason why China has been able to sustain its growth. Compared to South Africa, South Africa needs to do that transition. South Africa's trade is basically more with Europe and US. And with Europe slowing down very fast, and the US just trying to recover, South African trade has really slowed down significantly, and that has affected the growth in South Africa, which we are seeing about 2 to 2.5% growth in GDP. Brazil is now being fueled by construction activities, particularly in relation to the World Cup. So we need to see how the Brazilian economy will fare after the World Cup, and I think they're also playing the Olympics there. The next Olympics also in Rio de Janeiro. The Brazilian economy would have suffered more if not for the huge construction going on in that country. Russia is a bad case. I don't think Russia has done well. Russia is also one economy that has been also dependent on the extractive industry, the oil and gas sector. You could actually see that the impact of the shale gas is beginning to have effect on the Russian export of gas. The European countries are no longer as dependent on Russia for gas supply as they used to be. And you find out that the Russian economy has actually been strengthened. Then you look at India. India has been a service-oriented economy, providing service in IT, in medical services, in outsourcing, and that, to a large extent, the Indian economy has remained relatively stable. But what will drive the growth in the world economy going forward? I think Africa will be a major factor. Beyond these countries, you still have some powerhouses that are coming up in Africa. Apart from Africa, you also have some South Asian countries, Bangladesh, Indonesia, that are presenting strong growth, Vietnam, that are presenting strong growth prospects. And then if you come to Africa, you look at a country like Nigeria, with a population of about 170 million citizens, growing at about 6.5% GDP, with the ongoing efforts to rebuild our infrastructural base, with our high level of youth. You look at the demography of the country, you find that Nigeria presents one of the growth potentials. If you look at the World Bank report on this country that was just released, it said that our reserve will grow to something like 80 billion in the next 4 years. And they also recognize that our economy is doing well. So apart from Nigeria, you have countries like Kenya, you have other countries like Angola that has been growing very fast.
Sorry to bother him, but apart from Nigeria, because the World Bank also did say that volatile oil prices, still threatening many African economies that are still reliant on oil. We know them, Nigeria, Angola, and some of the rest of them. Do you see these countries, including Nigeria, being able to successfully move away in terms of diversifying their economies away from this reliance on this black oil, as we've seen countries in the West now reducing their dependence on this natural resource?
You see, the truth is that there's no other way to go. If we have to sustain our growth, we must diversify the structure of the economy away from oil. Oil, we know in the next 30 to 50 years, may no longer be as critical a commodity as it is today. We are talking of discovery oil in almost all the countries in Africa. You also have this issue of shale gas. You have advancement in technology. You also have diversification in energy sources. Solar energy will improve further. Wind energy will improve further. And eventually, the cost of these energy sources will decline, and the efficiency will improve. So over time, the importance of oil will decline or decrease. So I think the only way for African countries to sustain their current tempo of growth is to diversify. And Nigeria is one of the countries I think is diversifying. Like I said, it's not going to be a light bulb effect. You're not going to wake up in the darkness, from the darkness, all of a sudden to brightness. So you're going to see a gradual transition. Some areas of value added we're beginning to export. And what we just need is further diversify along the entire value chain. And then we should be able to have a sustainable growth in the GDP.
Now, talking about the scorecard, coming back, it's not like it's 5 years, where summits where the leaders meet every 5 years. They meet every year, and sometimes growth, or achievements or success from the year before is not so visible. But would you, coming back to next year, would you like to see, would you like a situation where the leaders can sit down and say, yes, this is our scorecard, this is what we've been able to do from the last summit or the last 2, 3 summits, something to help maybe boost competition among the economies, or a situation where we can say countries come and they put their scorecards on the table and say, yeah, we've been able to do this. Last time we were here, I talked about the fact that we're doing this project, but now we've actually completed it, and this is what we're doing. This is where we're at.
The scorecard won't come in that format. The scorecard, there are already several parameters for measuring the performance of countries in the world. You have the GDP growth rate. You have the ease of doing business in each country. You have the poverty index.
And the human development index. All of those are already,
all those are
performance indicators already.
You use to measure the performance of countries. So when we talked about that, African countries account for 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies. We're looking at GDP growth rate. You look at the employment level. 70% of African youths are unemployed. So by the time we're talking of next year, we'll be looking at, has that gone down? And then you also look at, in terms of the level of trade between African countries. And like I did mention, currently we're talking about 8% of the total trade between African countries.
Okay, so when they come back next year, you want to see...
We want to see more of that. Has it increased to 15% or 20%? Okay. So those parameters will be there. I don't think they're going to reinvent or invent new parameters for measuring the performance of the economies of the African countries. Those parameters are there. The key thing is that what we needed to do at that conference was identify those bottlenecks that are impeding growth and diversification of those economies. And those things have been identified. It's now left for the national governments to go back and address those issues. And the way there need to be integration and interchange of information between those countries, we need to do all those things. Okay. Which one of the reasons why the Nigerian South African Business Forum was also held as an aside to the World Economic Conference.
To boost trade between South Africa and Nigeria.
South Africa and Nigeria. Okay. And then deepen the level of economic integration, interaction between those countries.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, Johnson. I'm afraid we're completely out of time now. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.